This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us for episode 57 is Jungian analyst and filmmaker Peter Ammann in Aarau, Switzerland. He is currently a lecturer, training analyst, and supervisor at the International School of Analytical Psychology in Zürich, where he is also in private practice. After training as a cellist in Paris, he attended the University of Zürich, where he earned a Ph.D. in musicology and in the history of religion and ethnology. He wrote his doctoral thesis on the musical theory and philosophy of Robert Fludd. While in analysis with Jolande Jacobi, Dr. Ammann was encouraged by Jung himself to pursue analytic training. He eventually went on to attend the Jung Institute Zürich, where his training analyst was Marie-Louise von Franz. He spent 4 years in Rome, working alongside Federico Fellini, and later became an independent filmmaker and collaborator of Television Suisse Romande in Geneva, and a member of the Swiss Film Board. His work on Fellini's film The Satyricon is beautifully detailed in an article by Giovanni Sorge, titled A Swiss Analyst in Cinecittà. Peter Ammann speaks of Fellini, Mastorna, Satyricon, and Africa in volume 25-3 of the San Francisco Jung Institute Library Journal. Inspired by the work of Sir Lawrence van der Post, whom he met in 1984, Dr. Ammann traveled throughout Namibia and Botswana, where he made several documentary films on the Bushmen, including Spirits of the Rocks and Living in Two Worlds, Communication Between a White Healer and Her Black Counterparts. At the request of psychiatrist and Jungian analyst Vera Berman, Dr. Ammann went to South Africa in 1990 to begin giving seminars and lectures at the Jung Center in Cape Town, which he still continues to this day. At the IAAP Congress in 2007, he organized workshops that brought together Jungian psychotherapists and traditional African healers. In the February 2020 issue of the Journal of Analytical Psychology, a 4-part series by Dr. Ammann, 2 other analysts, and an African healer was published, entitled Encountering the Other, Jungian Analysts and Traditional Healers in South Africa. Videos of their dialogues in Cape Town are available on the Southern African Association of Jungian Analysts website. Those topics and more are the subjects of our talk today. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, March 18th, 2020, through the magic of Skype. Dr. Ammann, you are, from what we know, the only living Jungian analyst currently in 2020 who actually met Jung. So I was wondering if you would share with us that story.
Yeah, it's incredible, but it's true. I was studying music. I wanted to become a cellist. And after a while, I decided to get in touch with a Jungian analyst, and I was really happy that I could contact Jolande Jacobi. And while I was still continuing my studies in Paris, every once in a while I saw her, and one day, and that was in 1956, when I was 25, that she said, I think you should go and see Jung. And she wrote a letter to Aniela Jaffe, and I got an appointment, not an analytical hour, but just a visit. And so one day in April 1956, I was invited to go and see Jung in his house. And
he invited you?
I got an invitation from Aniela Jaffe.
And she is, at the time, she was Jung's secretary.
She was Jung's collaborator and secretary.
Okay.
Yeah. And there I was, and then I was on the first floor, in a waiting room, and Jung appeared. He was 81 at the time.
And how old were you?
I was 25.
Okay.
And he had a few months before lost his wife, Emma.
Mm.
I remember that very well.
Mm-hmm.
He had a black ribbon on his arm. And then he said in his typical Swiss Basel dialect, "What do you want?" And I said that I would like to talk to him, because I was still studying music, but I was not so sure if that was my vocation. And that I even was playing with the idea to study Jungian psychology. And then he, to my great surprise, made the following associations. He said, music has to do with listening. And then he made a link between what in German means das Gehör and Gehorsam. The English verb obey comes from the Latin obedire, which means to give ear, to listen. To give ear, to obey, Jung went on, leads to what is called obedience. Thus, in a very subtle way, and surprisingly, Jung suggested that I should listen to my inner music, to my inner voices. So that was the beginning. And it took me still another couple of years until I started studying Jungian psychology. So that's the first important thing I remember. And then we spoke for 1 hour about in his library. And towards the end, I remember he showed me down and said, there are so many things in psychotherapy and psychiatry I do not know anymore. And I took this always as a sign of modesty. I do not know everything. I focused on certain important things. And that's why I think nobody should tell me, okay, Jung did not do this or that. You should not do this or that because Jung did not do that, let's say, in psychotherapy. He had a certain modesty, and he had to focus on the things he was interested in. Yeah, that was for me the beginning and the end of this hour. That was so to say the legacy, the most important things he gave to me.
And he spent time with you that day. He saw you because you were an analyst of Jolande Jacobi?
I think so. It might also be that because my grandfather was a pioneer of, he was a famous pediatrician. And Jolande Jacobi gave attention to important things like that. He's the grandson of Emil Fehr, who was a pioneer in pediatrician. He was the first one to specialize and to have a medical practice just for children in Switzerland.
Oh, I see.
So it might be that I do not know. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, it's astonishing that I could go and see him.
How did you meet Jolande Jacobi? And also, would you tell us a little bit about her relationship with Jung?
At the time, I would have had the courage to try to get in contact with Jung directly, because I always wanted to meet important people, to get inspired. But I knew that his health was not very good. Mm-hmm. And so I thought, I looked up in the library of my very old grandfather, and I discovered that book Jolande Jacobi wrote on Jung psychology.
Yes.
Took it and opened it And so, and then I looked in my telephone book and I called her and I went to see her. And then she treated me in a way that it was absolutely natural that a week later I would return. And I was happy.
Yeah.
I was happy. My Jolande Jacobi came from a Jewish family from she was from Hungary originally, then from Vienna, and just before the war, apparently she came to Switzerland with very little money, and then she became one of the important and famous disciples of Jung. She was an analyst who nowadays many would say she was too pushy. You see?
Too pushy.
Pushy. I mean, she was the contrary of a Freudian analyst.
I see.
And you can you see, she pushed me to go and see Jung, but I'm very grateful to that. I mean, that was unique. Huh?
I love what you said about wanting to meet or spend time with
important people.
Important people, right. I feel the same way. And you said it's because you want to become inspired by them. And my whole life, I've done that too, for that very same reason. And people looking in from the outside can sometimes mistake that for other ulterior motives. But I really liked what you said, because that is a great way of explaining it, is that I too am inspired by great and important figures. And in fact, I'm just going to skip to something and we'll come back to it later. In preparation for this episode, I watched 2 DVDs of you speaking. The first was an interview that you did with the filmmaker, and I believe he's now a Jungian analyst himself, Lewis Morris. He made a series of DVDs, conversations with Jungian analysts from Zurich. It's called Jungian Speaking. And the second DVD that I watched was your 85th birthday lecture that you gave at ISAPZURICH, which was filmed, and it is wonderful. It's full of footage and you speaking about all the people that inspired you, Jung being one of them. And so we can get back to that a little later, but just to finish up, so after that meeting you had with Jung, did you started reading his books, or you went straight away to apply for training at the Jung Institute? How did that happen?
No. Yeah, I was, I am, and I was, and I still am a slow man. And it took me this meeting with Jung happened in 1956, and I started studying at the Jung Institute in 1958. You see, so it took me another 2 years to make up my mind and to listen to my inner music and to follow that way, which was, so to say, inspired in a way this meeting with Jung.
Mm-hmm. So you said that you studied the cello and then you worked on your Ph.D. at the University of Zürich. You studied music, but you also studied religion, the history of religion and ethnology. And would you tell us a little bit about why you chose that background?
I decided to study musicology because I was a musician. But my cello diploma did not help me to fulfill the requirements of the Jung Institute.
Okay.
I needed a doctorate, and so I thought this is the way I can do it, because at the University of Zürich, the professor of psychology and philosophy was not a friend of Jungian psychology, to put it mildly.
Oh my. Okay.
So I studied musicology. And my other interests, ethnology and history of religion. That was because we have to choose secondary topics.
what was it like in the 50s and the 60s when Jung was still alive and Jungian psychology was new, right? It was relatively new. And what was the sentiment there? It was a very small population of Jungians. How was it received?
I mean, looking back, of course, it was a small population. You must imagine the institute was founded in 1948, and now I started 10 years later, which seemed a long time. But we were still a very small group. I mean, if you go to the psychological club in Zürich now, which now is in the same building as at the time there was the Jung Institute, this is a room where maybe 30, 40 people maximum could gather.
Yes.
So, but we had all the well-known people lecturing: Jolande Jacobi, Marie-Louise von Franz, Barbara Hanna, Karl Kereni, Erich Neumann, and so on. And that was, of course, fantastic. Huh?
Yes, and you got to meet them and attend their lectures. And I don't believe I've asked anybody this on the podcast before. There is a statement that is attributed to Jung where he said, "I'm glad that I'm Jung and not a Jungian." And when people come at me with that statement, I just kind of walk away. I don't want to get into it. But I'm sure you've heard that before, and I was wondering if you would say a little bit about that, why he would say something like that and what that means to you.
You see, I think the idea or the importance, the emphasis of Jung gave on his ideas was to develop, to find the individuum, to find your own way. That's Jungian, to find your own way, not to be like Jung. I mean, to smoke the pipe, to make a very ridiculous example, or laugh like him, or all these things. This is not important. The important thing is to find your own way. That's the basic idea.
Mm-hmm. But he is a guide, right? A teacher.
He's a guide. Yes.
Yes, and
you see, that's the thing. When I met the famous Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini, with whom I made later apprenticeship, and he asked me, "Is there a monument of Jung in Zurich?" And I said, "No, there is not." He was terribly disappointed. Mm-hmm. Of course, I'm also disappointed, but in a way I'm also glad, because the idea is not to make of Jung a monument of stone. He was a living creature and a man alive. And that's what I remember, that even during that hour that I spent with him, I saw that he was sometimes bitter, not being recognized, not being understood, and so on. So he was not the holy man, to become a monument.
Right. But I do consider myself Jungian, and it's based on his ideas, his research, and his teachings. I don't look at him as a holy man, but I do espouse his teachings and his ideas. And I'm wondering if at the end of his life, do you think he had any idea that his psychology would live on and be as big and as widespread as it is today?
It's difficult to answer. Mm-hmm. There is also, of course, it's wonderful to see that Jungian psychology developed and it's widely spread. And so, but I heard also the story that one day there was maybe one of the first international congresses of Jungian psychology, and the the Ernst Bernhard, who was the first Jungian analyst who had to leave Germany because he was a Jew, and he was in Italy, and he said to Jung, you see all these colleagues, these Italian analysts, and then it seems that Jung said, I see it with terror. That the quantity did not impress him. It was the quality.
I did hear you say in a lecture that when somebody had asked you about imitating Jung, you said, become the one you are meant to be. And to me, that's at the root of what we do in analysis and at the core of Jungian psychology. And I think that possibly gets overlooked. And would you tell us what you mean by become the one you are meant to be?
Yeah, you see, if I look back on my life, I had at a certain point I had the idea that I wanted to be a musician, a cellist, a famous cellist, and what happened? Even at the age of I was 27, I continued to play and even to teach the cello, but my main direction was now to study Jungian psychology. Who had imagined that? Right. Was that the idea that I become who I was meant to be? I didn't know that. And even later, then when I was at the end of my Jung Institute studies, I had the desire to go back to something artistic again. No. I just couldn't imagine now the whole week only listen to clients. Right. And so I had developed the idea that I wanted to go somehow into film work. Mm-hmm. And I became, after some years, a documentary filmmaker at the same time. And is this now what I'm meant to be? And then, you see, then in 1984, one day I went to see a film called Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. It was a wonderful film by the famous Japanese filmmaker Oshima. And at the end, I saw it. The film was based on a novel by Lawrence van der Post. Well, I should have known him, but I didn't, because he was often in Zürich. And so I started to read his books. And I wrote to him, I met him, and all this was happened in a time I was already 53. I imagine 53. All of a sudden, I never had the idea to go to Africa. And it opened a completely new door to a completely new world for me. So, yeah. So life, yeah.
So this was just random. I mean, so were you practicing as an analyst while you decided, at the time that you decided to pursue filmmaking?
Yes, when I so to say emigrated to Rome, it was with the idea that I would like to try to get in touch with Fellini, who was a fervent admirer of Jung. But at the same time, I started also to see clients there because I had to earn a little bit of money. Mm. But then when after some problems Fellini had, he had a real crisis in his creative life. When he started filming again and did Satyricon, I stopped. I couldn't see his clients anymore because I did a kind of apprenticeship with him.
But how did that relationship start? How did you get to actually meet such a famous film director?
Yeah, you see, that's also an interesting story, because first I thought, okay, I did it in an awkward way. I went to his office and gave him some photos of a friend and thought maybe by chance I will meet him, but it didn't happen. So I was given by a lady who was, so to say, my landlady in Rome. She said, "Why don't you call him?" And I called him. And when there was an assistant of Fellini on the phone, and at the very moment I said, "I am a Jungian analyst from Zurich," the assistant's voice changed. Mm-hmm. And I had an appointment the following day. And Fellini immediately treated me in an incredibly friendly way, and after a few days or weeks, he invited me to see him because Jung meant so much to him.
Mm-hmm. And had you known that when you became interested in Fellini? Had you known of his affinity for Jung and the fact that he was in analysis himself?
Yeah, because at the time, his films 8½, mm-hmm. and Juliet of the Spirits were shown in the cinemas, and both films are really influenced by a Jungian look. And then I do not know how I knew that he was in analysis with Dr. Bernhard.
Okay. So
I thought maybe that would be the bridge that I could, because there was no film school in Switzerland, nothing. Mm-hmm. You know? I had no connections. Mm-hmm. So to say, Jungian psychology was the bridge which enabled me to get accepted by Fellini.
And I smile every time I hear you mention the film 8½, because I saw that movie at the Jung Center in Chicago many, many years ago. They have a movie night once a month, and they screen that, and I'll always remember that. So that was a very inspiring, would you say, relationship for you, that you helped him, but he also helped you?
So I would say he helps me.
But he was going through a sort of crisis at the time, yes, wasn't he? And
yes.
and he threw the I Ching. Would you tell that story?
Yes. But I would first of all I would make a statement. I was not his analyst.
Right.
Even if he told me dreams, and he wanted to talk about his dreams, and he wanted to talk about Jung, where he was very curious, but I was not his analyst.
Right.
So that's very important to remember.
Okay.
But at the moment, when he was just a few weeks before starting a big film, which was Satyricon, with enormous preparations, enormous amount of money, he was in deep crisis. He was afraid he could not do his film for this or that reason. And we were in Rome, and he was driving in my car, and he said, "Let's stop here at the Forum." And he threw the coins on the carpet in my little old car, and wanted to see how the signs were. And they were negative. Mm. And he had a very, very negative dream at the same time. Mm. And so he wrote a letter to his producer and cancelled everything, which was an act of sincerity and of enormous courage.
Yeah.
Because he was attacked, and of course the people would lose money and work and so, but he just couldn't do it for inner reasons.
For inner reasons, yeah.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Yeah, he went through a long time. Once he said, "I lose my professional capacity of a filmmaker because I'm not working anymore." It took about 2 years until he finally got out of that crisis. He was ill, and then he decided finally to drop that film which he wanted to make when I met him. Mm-hmm. And he switched into a completely other world, Satyricon, and that allowed him to free himself of his problems in a way, of his past.
So what would you say of creative illnesses like that, on how we are encouraged to try to make them go away, cheer up, or plow through? Instead, he listened to his inner voice and the signs, right? Or the symbols, I should say, around him.
Yeah, you see, I mean, Fellini in that sense would be an example, because he was an immensely creative filmmaker, and when your creativity comes to an end, so to say, this is a tragedy, huh? And so you end up in the desert, and he was crossing the desert, and he had a dream book, and that dream book is published, by the way, and I discovered only after Fellini's death that he had a dream book. But then I remembered certain dreams he had told me. I saw them, I discovered them in his book.
Yes, and that book is available, and it was just republished on the occasion of his 100th birthday this year.
Exactly. And I mean, of course, the dreams he told me are just in that period between when I met him, 66, and let's say 68, when he started Satyricon. Then afterwards, I think he was busy with his film and could not, so to say, he came out of his crisis and could be creative again. Huh? So it's to answer your question, the way he went through that creative crisis is an example of what we, on a smaller level, what happens to us can happen to all of us. Huh?
And what is it? It's different for each person. What causes the kind of the creativity to dry up or go underground for a while, and us not to be able to access it?
Maybe many people who go into who are forced to go into a Jungian analysis might be because they, in one or another way, they're stuck. Huh?
Yeah,
they're stuck, and there comes the important message of Jung, that you pay attention to what we call the unconscious, what we call the dreams, to that other world. Huh? And here is also maybe the moment to talk about something which is, that later I went to Africa.
Yeah.
And especially South Africa, and I saw that especially among the black population, the dreams are alive. They have what I call dreaming is part of life. It's not something you discover or you cultivate once you go to see a shrink.
Right.
And this is what Jung's most important message might be, that we should also consider our dreams, take it in account, and make them part of our life. This is something which in the African culture, not only, in many indigenous cultures, is much more alive than in our westernized civilization.
And I just want to mention that on this podcast, I like to focus on the classically trained Jungians. And I heard somebody ask you, what is the classical Jungian approach? And you said it is having a rapport with the unconscious, with our dreams, with our ancestors, and having that constant dialogue. and negotiation with our ancestors. And now, is that something that you learned in Africa? So let's talk about how you wound up traveling to Africa, because really the subject that I want to cover is the African roots of Jungian psychology.
Yes, you see that, I mentioned it before, it was Lawrence van der Post, that film, and then when I met him, I discovered his books, and so I got fascinated.
Let's back up a little bit, because there's some listeners that might not know who he is. So who was Lawrence van der Post?
Lawrence van der Post was born in South Africa in 1906, and he was one of a big family, and but he was apparently always a kind of dreamer, and people he ridiculized him because he was a dreamer. So he was in a way he was born Jungian.
Okay. And he knew Jung, didn't he?
He then, because his wife, Ingaret, went in 1948 to Zürich to study Jungian psychology. And so Lawrence van der Post came also to Zürich and met Jung. And he describes this meeting in his book on T.G. Jung and the story of our time. The way he met him and how he was impressed by him, and so whenever he had the possibility of maybe going out to Africa or coming back from South Africa, because he then lived in London, he stopped, and he became what he called himself. He was Jung's messenger boy.
Oh,
he's African messenger boy.
Oh, I see.
Because Jung himself had the great nostalgia of Africa. He had this wonderful, difficult but wonderful experience in Africa in 1925, 1926. And he always maybe hoped, I don't know if he had the desire to go back, but he never went back. But he liked to talk with van der Post about Africa. And in his later writings and teachings, and so his experience and experiences of Africa, he mentions many times. It was also for him a decisive turning point in his life.
Did his wife become an analyst?
Yes, she did not graduate, but she studied there, and I do not know exactly the details. She did not have the diploma from Zurich, but she then worked also as an analyst.
What was her name?
Ingaret Griffith.
Lawrence van der Post he passed away, I believe, in 1996. He was a close friend of Prince Charles, and he is the godfather of Prince William.
Correct.
So, and I had read that Prince Charles looked at him as his, quote, spiritual guru. And so you said, you had told me earlier that meeting him was a turning point in your life. And how so?
Can you just ask again?
Yeah, when you met Lawrence van der Post, because before meeting him, you had read his books and you were greatly...
Yes, it was a turning
point in your life.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty heavy thing to say. So how did he affect you?
It's on one side, it was his personal influence on me, the meeting this man who was very sensitive. And for instance, he was not an analyst, but I can confess that every once in a while, I told him a dream, especially in connection with my African interests, and hope to go there. And he remembered the dreams after years.
And that's wonderful.
He made astonishing associations, And And then came the coincidence that at the same time, a few years later, after I met Lawrence, Vera Burman, the grand old lady of South African Jungian psychology, invited me to teach there in Cape Town. And so I went there, and I met the country, and at the same time I was invited to go on a wilderness trail with the famous conservationist Yen Player, who also was a admirer not only of Lawrence van der Post but of Jung. So we went on a wilderness trail, and Yen Player showed us the famous rock paintings of the Bushmen, and he suggested that I make a documentary film on that. And so I discovered that world. You see, you go you walk in the landscape of South Africa, Southern Africa, and it is like an open air museum. There are all over the places, there are hundreds of little caves, shelters, where they painted, and this was, so to say, the first testimony of the human being's imagination. All the animals were painted, and now you must imagine what that means, that the human brain, the human spirit, for the first time not only sees a line but can also make a design. It's an enormous step in consciousness also. All this led to my interest in the Bushmen, later in the Black Healers, and let's say the man who opened the door to all this was Lawrence van der Post.
So Jung did visit Africa in 1925, 1926.
Yes, I mean he started in October 1925, and he came back in March.
Wow. So that was several months, and he was with Peter Baines, who made a film. So there was a lot of filmmaking going on at this point. I mean,
yeah, but it's very short. It's just little clips, you know.
Clips, and you had told me that
you see him.
Yeah, you see Jung there in Africa, and that the best footage obtainable is in Lawrence van der Post's film.
Exactly. Yes.
And I found out that is available at the Library of Congress here in the United States.
On what kind of, is it a DVD or is it a...
No, it's not. You have to actually physically go to the Library of Congress and view it there. So you said that you were greatly influenced by van der Post, and did you travel with him through Africa?
No. You see, I had a secret hope when I met him. Mm-hmm. That was in 1984 for the first time. I secretly hoped that I could do some film work with him, because he had done film work with other people. Then he was, what was he? He was 70, or well over 70s, and he said, "Oh, you know, I'm too old," which was not true at all. Mm-hmm. Because he went many times to Africa after that. But he said, "You must meet Yen Player, and you must go and see if you can make a documentary with him on a what is called a wilderness trail, to go into a part of a game reserve, without cars, without roads, with the wild animals." To be careful, to respect nature, and so, and to have that experience. And when the Jung Institute in Cape Town was founded, Lawrence van der Post and Yen Player were part of it. They wanted the students to go at least once on a wilderness and to have that experience, that be part of a training. Imagine. it was then thrown out of the regulations and just only recommended.
Oh.
And Van der Post and player were very furious about that, but that's the way it goes.
And in the DVD of your 85th birthday lecture that I mentioned earlier, you do include footage of Van der Post speaking about his time with the Bushmen of the Kalahari. And he mentioned something very interesting. He says the people in the desert, they talk about the two hungers, the big hunger and the little hunger.
Yes.
Would you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, so to say, the little hunger would be the concrete hunger. You need to eat. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is not so easy in the desert or in the half desert. And for hunter and gatherers, to kill an animal is quite. It's an adventure, an experience. It's something special, and so you are also grateful if you succeed in doing so. So that's one thing. But then you have what Lawrence van der Post thought so, or told us in such an impressive way. The big hunger, the great hunger for spiritual things,
and for meaning.
For meaning.
Yeah.
For stories. I mean, if you take away the story of people, you take away their soul.
So now, is that something I'd like to hear about what you learned in your travels through Africa and how you said that all of Jung's work is there. It's there in the African healing system.
Yeah, in a way, you know, the concepts of Jungian psychology are not invented out of the blue. They are, if you go back, it's okay, Freud started it in a way, and then Jung, of course, amplified the whole thing, the importance of dreams. But if you speak with African healers, and apparently in the whole of South Africa, there are 25,000 black healers. Huh? So there might be some charlatans, not serious people like everywhere, but it is a kind of mixture between a medical doctor, a priest, a psychologist. And for them, when Vera Buurman met her counterpart, a black healer, and the black healer said, if my clients do not dream, I cannot treat them. Vera Buurman said, then we are colleagues. Huh?
Yes.
So the importance of dreams is something we share with that culture. And that there are big dreams, great dreams, archetypal dreams, and that there are small dreams. All this is also in Africa, you see the same. They distinguish, they have special words for big dreams and small dreams. You see that when Jung says the unconscious corresponds to the mythic land of the dead, the land of the ancestors. We call it the unconscious, which is just a word for something. And the land of the ancestors means our heritage, our fathers, grandfathers, and then it goes back and back and back and back until you have forefathers whose faces we don't know anymore.
Right.
So see, this is so to say the archetypal foundation, and it's the same. They call it the land of the ancestors. They dialogue. They have an exchange with their ancestors. It's something it's difficult for us to understand.
Right, because we tend not to, but it's also alive today. I mean, it's not just the land of the ancestors.
No, it is alive today. Today, they have constantly this presence of the ancestors.
Yes.
And when Jung talks about active imagination, so to say, to have a dialogue with inner figures, It is very... So I see active imagination, dialogue with the ancestors, something.
So there are parallels.
Yeah, parallels. When you talk of transference, Vera Burman says that the difference between the African and the Western way is they act out what we talk about. They act out. So we talk about transference. The Bushman healer, when he has a trance dance, he pulls out, so to say, the sickness of the sick person and transfers it to himself and then gets rid of it. It's very concrete. So even the concept of transference has its roots back in the past of these indigenous people. And even something else. We talk about animus and anima. And I came across a tribe called Baule. They say they have, for instance, a woman, she has a spiritual spouse. She has a wooden figure.
A wooden figure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And she says, I quote, "I have a spirit husband. Mondays I don't sleep with my husband." She sleeps with that man. What does it mean? But that's a so to say, it's a spiritual. It's the concrete way. What Jung calls animus or anima,
right?
Because a man has then a spiritual spouse. So that's astonishing that all these concepts of Jung are based on the human experience of the past.
Now, did he also realize that when he was there? Did he see that when in his talks?
I do not know, but he knows, of course. I mean, he was so much linked to the so to say the archetypal roots, and so that he knew that everything has its foundation in the past. Huh? That if he now exactly realized it in the same way as I now described it, I do not know. Huh? I wish I could talk to him.
Right. Right. But it wasn't that he went there in the 20s and spent several months there and got these ideas. He had these ideas.
He wanted confirmation.
He wanted confirmation. Okay.
Confirmation. There is a lot to say about this because in a way he did not get what he wanted always because people were very shy to communicate dreams. So in that sense...
you mean his patients or the people he encountered in Africa?
No. He just met that tribe, the Algoni, and he was there a few weeks maximum. Huh? Mm-hmm. And there was a language problem, and he tried to communicate, and he says himself he got very few dreams. And one of the chairmen said, "Well, we don't dream anymore because now the district commissioner from the British district commission tells us what to do. We don't know." This is in a nutshell what is the loss of the dream culture, which happened even to them, you see, by the influence of colonization.
So you have made several documentary films. You did make one on Lawrence van der Post and the Bushmen and their stories. No, you produced it?
It was not on Lawrence van der Post.
Okay.
I had just the possibility when Lawrence van der Post came to the Jung Institute in 1986. He was 80. He gave 3 lectures on bush people and the rock paintings and that world. And we were lucky because we were fortunate because I could convince a producer that we could have a camera and film the whole thing, and 3.5 hours of storytelling of Lawrence van der Post is now on DVD.
And all of these films that you made are available for sale on your website, and I will provide links to all of those in the show notes for this episode on speakingofjung.com. And you also made some documentaries about Vera Berman in South Africa, and you often traveled there to lecture at that Jung Institute, right?
Yes, yes.
Mm-hmm. And would you tell us a little bit about the Congress in Cape Town in 2007?
You see, in 2007, I had the privilege that I was allowed to organize 3 workshops where I tried to bring together Jungian analysts with African healers. Mm-hmm. And there was a small group of, 6, 7, 8 black healers. And then there was an enormous interest from the Jungians to attend these workshops. And in that sense, it was a success. But what for me was not a success, was that the interest was only from the Jungians toward these, so to say, exotic black healers, you see. But the black healers were not interested in our way.
Okay.
So it's only much later that I met a black healer who originally was Western trained. She is a clinical psychologist who at the age of 40 discovered her own roots and underwent training to be a healer. And she wrote a marvelous thesis on the ways women are trained to become healers. And on top of that, she was deeply interested in Jungian psychology. Mm-hmm. So that was the beginning of a way of, on a very small level, of a collaboration we had in 2016 and 2016. We had small conferences where we had about 15 people coming together and exchanging on an equal level. You see, not colonizing other people, colonizing with our Western ideas or Jungian psychology in a one-sided way, but to exchange and to learn from each other. And this was then honored in last year at the International Congress of Jungian Psychology in Vienna, that we could present the work we've done in a plenary session. And we will continue that.
So this was the work that you did in South Africa.
This, let's say, I inspired it, and I was really glad, I was happy, I was fortunate that some of the South African colleagues in Cape Town liked this idea and thought it was important, and so we started that movement together.
And in the February issue of the Journal of Jungian, it's the Journal of Analytical Psychology, right?
Exactly, yeah.
The February issue, you have a series of articles. You wrote one, and your colleagues wrote, I think, 3 others. And would you tell us about those?
Yeah, we just in these 4 small, we had 1 hour to present our what we've done.
Okay.
And each of us spoke for about 12 minutes, and so we explained how it happened, how it came about, and what we tried to do, and also in connection with the whole issue about what the so-called racism of Jung, which is, I think, a one-sided view, because Jung was certainly not a racist. On the contrary, he recognized and appreciated indigenous people highly, as you can in Memory Streams Reflections.
That's what I always thought, yes.
Yes. And so we could make a bit of a contribution to that controversy.
That controversy, yeah. And I have to say, on a personal note, I was very stunned to learn of this so-called controversy. I myself, my mother was born in Italy, and she came to the United States as an immigrant when she was 10 years old. I was born in New York City, a very diverse city. I grew up in a suburb of New York City in New Jersey, very diverse community. I lived in outside of Washington, D.C. for a number of years. I lived in Cleveland for a number of years, and now I live in Chicago. So I've always lived in very diverse cities. And with Jung, I knew of Jung through Memories, Dreams, Reflections, the collected works. He had a lot of Jewish friends, and he traveled the world. And I never, ever thought that there was anything reflecting any kind of racism or even anti-Semitism in his writings. And to hear that people are offended and that they're taking things literally and they're not considering the time in which he wrote is so ridiculous to me. And I have no time for that. So I was wondering if you had anything you would like to add about that whole issue, because this is the place where you could speak freely.
Yeah. You see, I mean, we must not forget that the time has changed enormously since Jung's time in Africa. When you see the images that he, with his, how you call this, tropical helm, he looks like a colonial man.
Yes.
Who goes there. And the black people who certainly didn't speak a word of English, there had to be somebody translate everything. And he wanted to get some information. He gave them a little bit of money for what they did done. It looks, yeah, it was the time when all these countries were British colonies.
Yeah.
But Jung went there. And as Blake Burleson, who wrote a book on Jung and Africa, right, Jung lived through that, all this, like what is in anthropology called, he was a participant observer. He went there and he underwent, he participated, and he was changed by the experience.
Mm-hmm.
He was changed. I mean, he was conscious of, or let's say, the danger, what is called, you go black, you know, you are so fascinated that you want to be like the African, huh? and then you lose your own root. He was conscious that he had to go back and to do the work here, with his problems here.
Mm-hmm. What would you say about us being white, looking at the black man as other?
Yeah, but we have this other. Now look, what is the big difference between the Jung Institute in the time when I was studying and now? There's a Jung Institute, now there's ISAP, and so I'm working at ISAP, and so mm-hmm. There, when I would give a lecture or a seminar, at least half, if not more, are people, other people from Asia, mm-hmm. from China, from Japan, mm-hmm. and so on. And not we haven't gotten black people really, maybe one or two. So, but it's not as in my time it was Americans, English, Germans, Swiss people. That was already diversity. Eh?
Jung was Swiss.
Yes.
And so you can't be more than one thing.
No.
Right? And so
but if you dig deep, know, as many Africans say, finally we have the same red blood.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to get to the bottom of this and talk about the difficult parts. Is it wrong for us as white people to, for instance, I was told a while back, a long time ago, that if I dreamt of a black person, that was my shadow. Well, that's pretty literal. And now that might be offensive to black people. Now, what if a black person dreams of a white person? Is that their shadow because it is other? They are not shadow because they're black. They're shadow because they are not what I look like.
First of all, you never forget that the shadow might be a good thing, because maybe there are good things in the shadow. Huh?
There you go. Right.
Yeah, I'll tell you a story.
Okay.
Numfundum Lisa, who is the black healer who was with us in Vienna, who was the first person I really met in South Africa, who was a clinical psychologist, a black healer, and interested in Jungian psychology. She told us that she had dreamt of white people. And at the time, before Mandela was liberated, that was a bad dream. White people, that's bad. And then after Mandela came into power and the situation changed, the dream was a good dream.
Oh, okay.
So that's she told that in Vienna, and everybody laughed because it's relative. But I mean that I dream of a black man. Yeah, he has things I do not have. No,
right.
And maybe I should develop.
Right.
I went to Italy, and people told me here in Switzerland when I was a child, you don't speak with your hands. You shouldn't move your hands. And I went, much later, I went to Italy, and everybody speaks with his hands.
Right.
So I was liberated, you see. That's only one small ridiculous example, that maybe in another culture you can so to say liberate what is
I love that.
in your shadow. Huh?
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So is the problem that some people had with Jung's writings that he used the word primitive?
Look, what does it mean, primitive?
Yeah.
It means first. Huh? Primus means first. Huh? Primitive means in nowadays, so to say, less developed.
Right.
Less developed.
Right.
But very often that word means primordial.
But isn't it the truth that there are some cultures that are not as developed, advanced as others?
Of course. But it depends what is developed and not developed. Maybe a certain kind of scientific way of thinking is not as developed in among a African tribe as it is here. But maybe they have a sensation or intuition which is much more developed than mine. You see?
Right.
Yeah.
And so as far as...
the Western man has developed certain functions, you can even call that Jung's typological functions like thinking and sensation in an extreme way at the cost of others.
Right.
Intuition or feeling.
Right. And so as far as what we call Black people in the United States, we call them African Americans.
Yes.
And as far as there not being a lot of African American Jungian analysts,
Yes.
that seems to be all of a sudden an issue. I actually only know of one. I have invited her onto this podcast multiple times, and she not only she hasn't declined, she just won't respond. Yeah. And so I've made the effort. It's just like I also get criticized for not interviewing a lot of women. I probably ask more women than men to do episodes with me, and they either decline or they just completely ignore the request. So I am not singling out a certain type of person to have on this podcast. I invite a lot of people, and I wind up doing episodes with the ones who are willing to do them. But as far as training more people of other cultures, from different backgrounds, the Jung Institutes are open to that. And it's not for everybody as far as interest. So what is the status of that? You are at ISAPZURICH. Would you tell us a little bit about the issue there?
Maybe here the issue is not so much. I mean, in the States, you have a certain percentage of Black people,
right?
Latino people. So in South Africa, there is it's the other way around. There is a minority of white people and many Black people. And what I say now for South Africa might also be valid for the States, that the one-to-one kind of analysis we are used to is maybe something very foreign to the Black mentality, where the community, the group, the family is most important. So we have to consider all this. And that's why, for instance, I think in South Africa, what we are doing, that there is a dialogue on the equal level, that we see now there are 2 Black leaders, 2 women who are going to share their knowledge with with a white analyst in Cape Town, okay, and even with the trainees. Mm-hmm. So they know the mentality. And maybe then one can see is this one-to-one kind of psychotherapeutic work, is this also for the Black people possible, necessary, or do we have to be open that they do it in a different way? That might be the main reason why there are so few Black analysts in the States. I do not think it is because of Jung's writings that there are few Black analysts in the States. Maybe that might influence one or the other person, sure. But it is a different mentality we have to consider. Right. That's why we should not colonize our way. Mm-hmm. We must have a dialogue and exchange on an equal level.
Mm-hmm. And that's happening now.
Okay, we try.
Yeah.
We try.
Right.
Yeah.
There are a few things that I neglected to mention. This always happens during a recording, so I'm going to now start at the end of each episode to go back and fill in some of the things I neglected to mention. When we were talking about Lawrence Vanderpost, he was in the British Army, but what I didn't mention is that he was actually in a Japanese prison camp for 3.5 years. And I often wonder if that is what affected his writings thereafter, and what that did to him.
Of course. This was probably a big turning point in his own life.
Right.
And there are people who criticize or attack Lawrence Vanderpost. There was a biography written by a man who said that Lawrence invented a lot of things and he was a liar and so on and so on.
Oh my goodness.
But if you see what he has done and what his co-prisoners tell what he has done, you can only say Lawrence Vanderpost was a great man in these difficult circumstances. And why I always had such a admiration for him was because he was for me an example of having a balance between action and reflection in one's life. Now, not only reflection, but also action. Not only action, but also reflection. That maybe I idealize him, but nevertheless, it's always, as we said at the beginning, we look up to certain people. They can be an example for us. They can inspire us.
I also heard you say that we need spiritual parents.
Exactly. That's why I like in English the word godfather or godmother. Mm-hmm. You don't have it in German. It's not the same. So it's because we have our concrete fathers and mothers and so, and maybe it's not always ideal,
right?
Or it's different from what we are born for, what we meant to be, and then we find a spiritual father. I mean, there is the Swiss tradition that the boy has 2 godfathers and 1 godmother.
Oh.
And the girl has 2 godmothers and 1. So see, the masculinity or the femininity is strengthened.
I see.
I got 2 godfathers.
Okay. I didn't know about that. That's interesting. And speaking of spiritual parents, we also did not mention much of Marie-Louise von Franz, who you knew. Yes.
She was an incredible teacher, lecturer, and of course writer. And I did the second part of my analysis with her. And maybe I can, or almost to conclude, I could tell you what, because I forgot everything.
Okay.
Of the analysis with her.
Sure.
Except one thing.
Okay.
When I was going towards the end of my Jungian training, I had this idea to go into filmmaking. But how to do it? Because there was no film school, nothing. And I was 35. And then there was a small film company in Switzerland, and they made a competition. They said, you can send in a little story, invent a story for a film, send it in, and the best one will maybe realized.
Okay.
So I thought, okay, maybe that's an idea that I could begin. And so I decided to write that story, but I was not lazy, but I was lingering. Is that the right word? Yes, lingering.
Yes.
Not going to do it. And then I went to see Marie-Louise von Franz, and she said, now, you do it, and when you've done it, you can come back. So that was for me the lesson, you know. Dreams are bubbles unless you realize them. There is a saying in Träume sind Schäume. Dreams are bubbles. Yes, they are bubbles. Unless you make them real. And that was her lesson she gave me.
To go out there and take action.
Take action. Do it. Yes, it was difficult, but I did it. Okay, it didn't help me very much because the story was never realized. Mm-hmm. I then found my way with Fellini, but I mean, it was, I had to do something and not just dream about it. Dream in the double sense of the word. Huh?
Right, right. Yes. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It was an honor to speak with you, Dr. Ammann. Thank you. Please visit the website speakingofjung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on what was discussed in this episode. There you'll also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. You can also listen to this episode on your Amazon Echo device simply by saying, Alexa, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts, or TuneIn. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. You can help support Speaking of Jung at no extra cost to you just by shopping at Amazon.com through any of the Amazon links on our website, or by registering through our links for any of the online video courses offered by the Jung Society of Washington, D.C. You can start these courses anytime, go at your own pace, and you'll have lifetime access to the material. You can find all of the details on the courses page at speakingofjung.com. So with special thanks to Chiron Publications and ISAPZURICH, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.